enjoying it. I'm not a total Grinch like that. But every year when all those decorations start going up and the big bags of fun-sized candies start appearing in the stores, I'm reminded of something I've tried a long time to forget. I used to live in an apartment in the city, and I'd spend a lot of my time sitting at my computer whenever I wasn't at work or at the gym. My desk was right next to a window on my left, and sometimes I'd find myself looking out of it and watching the city just go by. I wasn't a creep about it. I didn't stare at anybody or anything. It was more like people watching, wondering where folks have been, where they're going, and what kind of lives they lead. I saw people walking around during the holidays in their hats and coats, carrying gifts or trays of covered food. I saw all the new college kids moving in around September, wheeling office chairs along the sidewalk with bags slung over their shoulders. And then around Halloween, depending on which day it fell on, I'd see costume kids walking the streets and collecting candy and admiring each other's costumes. And despite what I said earlier about hating the holiday, I actually used to really dig it. I'd carve one of those miniature pumpkins to put on my windowsill and hang a small Happy Halloween banner above it. I'd put a bowl of candy down near the front door as well, something for the kids to help themselves too. And it quickly became one of my favorite times of the year, and I'd sometimes find myself window watching for that first hour after dark, standing there with a beer or a cup of coffee and just checking out what the costumes the kids were wearing that year. Now, back in 1989, it was a Batman year in a big, big way. The movie had just come out that summer, so I knew that I was going to see a lot of Bruce Waynes walking around down there. But the night itself was beyond anything I imagined. There was like an entire army of little Batmans out there, only occasionally broken up by the odd Nicholson-era Joker with a purple blazer and green hair. You got yourself your usual suspects, your vampires, your zombies, your werewolves. But that year, the Batman dominated. So maybe around 7 in the evening, I was done window watching and I was back at my desk doing a little work prep. And since it was all prep, sometimes I'd done a million times, I found it all very boring. And then as my eyes started to wander, I caught sight of a group of trick-or-treaters walking past my window. And out of habit, I turned to check out their costumes and was surprised to see a group of 4 kids, maybe 12 to 13, and without a single Batman among them. There was an Indiana Jones, a pretty good one too, but the one that really caught my attention was the kid dressed as John Rambo, complete with a black tank top and red headband. I was thinking, how the hell did a kid manage to catch a total gore fest? But then I remember my own 12-year-old self moving mountains just to get my hands on a copy of that Texas Chainsaw Massacre movie. And then right as I'm reminiscing about watching Leatherface going absolutely bat-poop crazy at the end of the movie, I see this dark gray van pull up next to the kids. I couldn't see the driver, but I saw the kids stop and look over towards the window where he was obviously talking to them. Seconds later, the driver got out of his seat, slammed the door closed, and walked around to the double doors at the back. The kids followed him, each of them looking curious as the guy kind of yapped away like he was trying to sell them something. And he looked normal, I guess, totally unremarkable. But as he's standing there talking to them and pointing towards the rear of his van, I get this sudden and terrible feeling that something awful was about to happen. I guess it was because of how cartoonishly suspicious it looked. Like it legitimately looked like a scene from some cheesy after-school special which has the theme Stranger Danger. But I guess that's what also gave me pause to look. I didn't know who that guy was, but those kids might, and it was entirely possible that he was one of their dads or uncles or something, there to actually get them after trick-or-treating. There were also 4 kids and only one of him, so unless he was some kind of ninja, there was no way that he was throwing all 4 into the back of that van, and it was unlikely he was dumb enough to even try. It was also right at the side of a normally busy road with apartments and houses on either side and with the occasional car driving past too. So unless this guy was a complete maniac, I couldn't see him trying to abduct 4 kids in such a busy, well-lit place. But no matter how much I tried to rationalize what I was seeing, no matter how much I told myself I was being paranoid or a scaredy cat, I couldn't help but shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. I managed to talk myself down a little, mentally at least. But when the guy opened up the rear of his van and looked like he was showing something to those kids, I actually turned in my chair and picked up my desk phone ready to call 911. and there was still that voice in my head saying, "He's not going to grab one of them, he can't. You're just being paranoid." And part of me was totally convinced that he was going to drive off without any sort of incident, and I was going to turn back to my chair feeling like an idiot. But there was this other competing voice too, one that said, "Get ready to make a note of that license plate." And then, as suspected, the unthinkable happened. As the kid in the front stepped forward, like he was almost trying to get a closer look at whatever was in the back of that van, the guy pounced. In what seemed like one fluid motion, the man picked the kid up off of his feet and then dragged him into the van. The kid's 3 friends ran off, just turned tails and ran, and as I hit 911 and brought my phone to my ear, I tried to get an angle so I could see the van's license plate. It took off so fast I wasn't able to read all of it, but I told the dispatcher everything that I'd just seen and was able to describe the guy and his van in quite a bit of detail. The dispatcher woman said that she had officers en route and that I could relax because the police would do everything they could. And that calmed me down a little at the time, but I guess the clue was right there in front of me. Because if the cops really did do everything they could, it wasn't nearly enough. The first missing persons poster went up just a couple of days later, and every single time I saw one, it was agony. The picture they used of the kid was obviously one from happier times, and thinking that he might never be that happy again just about killed me, because I saw the moment that changed his life forever. Now, I don't know if he was ever found. I hope he was, but part of me thinks that he stayed missing and was eventually declared dead. I later read that in America, a kid goes missing every 40 seconds and that almost 500,000 are reported missing every year. Most of them are returned home to their parents after they wandered off and got lost, but a large percentage of those that go missing are never reunited with their family. And I hope it wasn't the case, but sometimes I think that that kid was one of them, and on top of messing up my one chance to keep him safe, I got a front row seat to see pure evil leave its mark. Not just on me, but on the whole world. When I was in 8th grade and with Halloween fast approaching, me and my middle school buddies brought up the subject of trick-or-treating. Now at age 12, we felt like we were right on the cutoff point for it because when we got to high school, doing stuff like dressing up seemed like it'd get us very little candy and a whole lot of bullying. And then as we were talking about it, it suddenly hit us that 2002 would be our last ever year of trick-or-treating. Now I'll save you all the boredom of a long poetic diatribe about growing pains and putting away childish things, but I mean it when I say that we were bummed out as hell. Yet that only motivated us to go all out with our costumes so we could truly make that last night of candy mining one to remember. I didn't have the hair to dress up as Aragorn or Legolas, so I put together a hobbit costume consisting of a brown jacket, shorts, and a green blanket that I turned into a cape. I also got my hands on a pair of novelty human feet slippers, which really tied the costume together and made it look like I had giant, hairy hobbit feet. Now my buddy Chris dressed as Harry Potter, which was easily the best costume because he had all the Gryffindor merch to make it look legit. And then our 2 buddies, Richie and Matt, came as Spider-Man and Shrek, respectively, with Matt painting his entire damned head with green face paint and even dyeing his hair green too. And he got a gold star for effort. But without the bald head or Shrek ears and being skinny as a rake, he just looked kind of hilarious. Now we all met at my house at around 5:30, and then after putting some finishing touches on our costumes, my mom grabbed her camera and snapped a picture for posterity. And that picture ended up being something that I deeply cherish, even all these years later. We look so young and happy, but there's a sort of naivety about us too, because little did we know, this was the very last time we'd all be in the same place at the same time. We just didn't know it yet. We headed out onto the streets at around 6 p.m., and while Halloween was always a big deal around our neighborhood, that year it felt extra special. Whole platoons of costumed kids were being led up and down the sidewalk by their chaperones, and almost every single lawn was trying to out-spooky its neighbors with increasingly extravagant decorations. And if our business was candy, then business was good. People were so impressed with our costumes that wherever we went, we get at least a handful of goodies or two, even if in one case it was just a bunch of sugar-free candy and a toothbrush from someone who must have surely been a dentist. But it made for an awesome night, and we covered almost the entire neighborhood in almost 2 hours. But even when we'd hit up probably every house we could, and we had enough candy to last us till Thanksgiving, we still didn't feel like calling it quits. We wandered the streets, admiring costumes and lawn decorations, and talking about all the cool horror movies our parents wouldn't let us see for at least another 3 or 4 years. And the feeling that we had that night is still something I appreciate about Halloween, even after all these years. But it's a holiday that comes with a lot of unhappy memories, and all because about what happened at around 8:30 to 8:45 that night. Since Matt and Richie lived out in the sticks, their parents were due to pick them up from my place at 9. So right around 8:30, Richie suggested that we make our way back so they wouldn't leave their rides waiting. Chris seemed kind of bummed out that we were calling it a night, but we were all bummed out because we knew what it meant. It was the last time that we'd all get to spend as kids together because in a year's time, we'd all be young adults, as they were calling it at the time. And things were changing. I felt it. We all felt it. And it sucked. I didn't give Chris's bad mood a second thought, though. Not till we reached the place that we usually parted ways, and he just kept on following us back to my place. I figured that he might have been trying to catch a ride with Matt or Richie, but when I asked him, Chris said that he wasn't planning on going home. And he says, "There's got to be some more houses that still have candy," and explained that he wanted to get his last piece of Halloween candy ever, like a kind of ceremonial thing to end our night. And I thought that was kind of cool. But then Chris asked if I'd head back out with him once Matt and Richie had gotten their rides home. And I was pretty beat, so I just wanted to chill, eat some candy, and see if there was anything scary on TV. Besides, we had school in the morning and I didn't want to stay up too late. Chris was always relaxed, a reasonable sort of kid. But on this occasion, he did not react well to me declining his offer. And he says, "Dude, are you for real? This is our last Halloween ever, and you're just gonna sit on your ass and watch TV?" I told him I was tired, and even Richie responds, "Yeah, dude, how much candy do you need?" But Chris insisted. He said it'd only take like 30 minutes more, but then it was my turn to insist, especially on the fact that people wouldn't appreciate us knocking on their doors after 9 o'clock. And we started off on an argument, but then Chris cut it short to say, "Fine, whatever. If you're gonna be an asshole, nothing I can do about it." And this was just really, really strange behavior for Chris. I saw it. Matt and Richie saw it too. And at the time, I figured that Chris just didn't want the night to end. But these days, I think it was a sign of what was to come, and we just couldn't see it yet. And as Chris marched off, I yelled after him, asking where he was headed, and he mentioned a street that we hadn't covered yet, maybe 15 minutes walk away. And then after Matt responds, "The hell's gotten into him?" we went inside to just revel in our candy hauls before Richie's parents showed up. Now, Matt's mom followed closely behind, and then after managing to catch a little of the original Halloween movie on TV, I just went upstairs and hit the hay. I thought about Chris, about him knocking on those doors alone. And first I thought that I might have missed a place, that maybe a couple of houses had been like, "Here, take the rest of this candy, I don't want my kids rotting their teeth." And I could see him the next morning in school saying something like, "Dude, you missed out big time." But the next day, I woke up to a text message Chris had just sent after midnight, and all it said was, "Hello, meat pliers." I'm thinking, what the hell? "Hello, meat pliers?" And I texted back saying, "Lol, what the hell does that mean?" And since we should have both been getting up for school around that time, I figured that it wouldn't be long before I got a reply. But Chris never texted back. I caught up with Matt and Richie over lunch and asked if either had spoken to Chris that morning, and neither of them had heard from him, so I just brought up the weird message. But Matt and Richie figured it was Chris's idea of some joke or something. And I had to wait until I was out of school to call him, and after getting a voicemail a few times, Chris's mom answered the phone to tell me that he was sick. And my first thought was something like, "Stupid idiot ate so much candy that he made himself sick." And I texted Richie and Matt to let them know. And we figured that we'd see him the coming Monday in school once his blood sugar had lowered from critical to just warning. But he didn't show up then either. I tried giving him another call, but his phone was off, and then when I tried Chris at home, his mom told me he was still sick and she'd get him to give me a call when he was able. Now, I might have been 12, but I wasn't completely stupid. I still believe Chris was sick in some way, but I also had the feeling that there was something his mom wasn't telling me and there was more to it than just some illness. I brought up my suspicions with Matt and Richie at school, and by that point, they were also starting to think that something was going on. We hadn't heard from Chris all weekend, and we still hadn't spoke to him by Tuesday, so I figured that whatever was going on at home, it wasn't something that he wanted to talk about. And the best thing we could do was just give him his space and wait until the time came when he needed us, like really needed us, to be his friend. And Wednesday was the only day that I didn't call or text Chris, only because of what Matt said about giving him some space, but it still sucked. I felt like I was losing a friend, so that next day, Thursday, I rode over to Chris's place on my bike and called his cell from outside where I could see his bedroom. I figured that it'd just be all like other times, that it'd either ring out or it'd be switched off. But for the first time in days, Chris actually picked up the phone. I waited for him to say hello or what do you want or something like that, but he didn't say a thing. He just sort of stayed quiet till I asked, "Chris? Are you there?" He still didn't say anything, but I could hear him breathing, and he did the same thing when I asked if he was okay. He didn't say a damned word, he just sort of listened to me, and then he hung up. In those first few moments after he hung up, I was kind of heartbroken. I didn't realize it at the time, but something much larger and much more sinister was going on. But in the moment, all I could think was that he just sort of didn't want to be friends with me anymore. I figured I'd screwed up one of my best childhood friendships because I wanted to eat candy and watch movies, and it had me feeling like a big bag of crap. I didn't know what else to do, so I just tried calling Chris again. But when I felt a lump forming in my throat, I hit call end because I didn't want to sound like some sissy while I was talking to him. But then right as I looked up at his window one last time, I saw the curtain start to kind of twitch. Someone took hold of one of the curtain, and then after peeling it back, I saw Chris looking out from the dark of his bedroom. Only he didn't actually look like Chris anymore. Even from down his driveway, I could see how pale and gaunt he looked, and it was like his first time seeing the world outside. He looked all around at first, like he was almost scanning for something, and then these big, blank eyes locked on me. I raised a hand, intending to wave it, but I remember stopping short and just sort of holding my hand up to see if he'd react, and he didn't. He just stared at me like he wasn't even blinking up there, and then he disappeared behind that curtain again. I remember just sitting there on my bike seat, sort of staring up at Chris's window in a kind of daze. In the space of just a couple of minutes, I went from being worried to heartbroken to just straight up scared. Whatever was happening to Chris, it was serious, and I could tell that much from the way he looked. And you can call it intrusive if you want, but I'd be damned if I didn't try and find out what it was. I tried everything I could think of. I tried calling him a bunch more, I tried talking to his mom, and I even got my own mom to call her, thinking that maybe she might tell another grown-up what was really going on. But all Chris's mom would say was some variation on, "He's sick, he's getting bed rest, and he'll be out of school until he's well again." And at the time I thought that my mom might be in on it too, but by that I mean that Chris's mom had told her the truth and that she was hiding the truth from me for some reason. And I guess it was at an age when I was acutely aware that grown-ups didn't tell kids everything, and sometimes it was just a version of the truth and not the whole truth, if that makes sense. And so I got fixated on that till I asked my mom, and it wasn't until she actually got mad at me that I started to believe her. It was only then that I brought up Chris's "hello meat pliers" messages, how I was worried that he wasn't just sick and that something worse was happening. Mom gave Chris's family another call, and this was maybe a week after the first, so I figured that she might get an update of some kind. Well, she did get an update, and the update was that Chris and his family were leaving town. And when she told me, she said that there was a chance that Chris had stopped talking to us, as in me, Richie, and Matt, because he was upset about the move. She said that people handle stuff like that in weird ways sometimes, and that sometimes people choose to ignore their emotions instead of confronting them. I asked why Chris's mom would lie like that and say that he was sick, and she told me that parents protect their kids by any means necessary sometimes, and that a little white lie sometimes spares a whole lot of heartache. But it wasn't just a little white lie. I'd seen his face, so whatever was going on with Chris, I knew that it was serious. Mom said that I'd come to accept it as time moved on, but it didn't, and I never have. I think something happened to Chris that night that he went off trick-or-treating on his own, and I think it was so bad that he and his family either chose to leave town or just straight up had to. I tried looking him up on Facebook a while back, but he doesn't seem to have any kind of social media, and I figured enough time might have passed that he'd be willing to talk about it, but even if he is, I couldn't find him anywhere. Sometimes I think about that weird text message he sent too, and in my darkest moments, I think he wrote, "Hello, meat pliers," because he was using predictive text in a very terrified frenzy, and what he'd really meant to text was, "Help me, please." One of the most significant events of my whole childhood happened on Halloween. So a few friends and I were out trick-or-treating, and we actually went pretty much to every neighborhood within walking distance. And then on the way back, we found ourselves wandering past a place of almost legendary status. And for as long as we'd been aware, there was this old house in the neighborhood over from us. One close to the other homes, but also disconnected by large, overgrown front yards and a fairly long driveway too. Now, we never saw anyone home, and we never saw any cars in the front yard, and we never saw anyone either coming or going. We were pretty sure it was abandoned in some capacity, that someone owned it but never visited. But what we were 100% certain of is that the place was haunted. If you saw the place at 13, you'd probably think it was haunted too. Heck, see the place at 30 and you probably still think that that place has a resident ghost or two. It looked like a haunted house. All old and gothic and stuff, like the kind of place the Addams family would live. And so naturally, a bunch of over-imaginative 13-year-olds were convinced there were long-dead spirits wandering the halls. And as we walked past, we all went a little quiet, just kind of checking the place out before our buddy Charlie slowed down to a stop. And this big grin came over his face, I remember. And then he says, "How much candy are you going to give me if I knock on that door?" Now we're all thinking, dude, there's no way you're about to knock on that door. But Charlie bet his entire bag of candy that he would, and suddenly none of us would take his bet because he was clearly very serious about dingle-dong ditching this haunted house. Now, I still had my doubts, and when I bet him a handful of candy he wouldn't do it, our two other friends did the same. And then once the bets were in, off goes Charlie, bold as brass down that driveway. We carried on watching him walk up the driveway, pretty skeptical and doubtful, and then when he got to the door, Charlie looked back at us. He was trying to be brave and not show any fear, but even from all the way down the driveway, we could see how nervous he was. Now, I remember hearing, "I told you you wouldn't do it." But then I guess Charlie did too, because right after it got said, Charlie raises his fist and knocks on that door. And one of us actually gasped, I remember. And I remember not giving a crap about candy at that point because Charlie just hammered on the door of some haunted house. And we all watched in silence as he backed away from the door, turning his body as if he was about to run. But not only did the door not open, but nothing moved and nothing stirred. The house stayed dark and incredibly quiet, and the longer it did, the more Charlie's confidence started to build. He stopped, and instead of walking back down the driveway towards us, he walked right back to the front door of the house and knocked for a second time. He did it even louder that time and with a kind of playful rhythm too. Do-do-do-do-do-do-do. And we're laughing among ourselves by that point, mainly at just how brazen Charlie was being. And then once he heard and saw us laughing, that only spurred him on more. And when he knocked a third time and started yelling out, "Hello? Anyone home?" We thought it was hilarious as kids. I guess it was all that tension being relieved, realizing that our fears about that place had been completely unfounded. Charlie started yelling about how if a ghost didn't appear to give him a treat, he was about to give them a trick they'd regret. Then he yelled that he was going to come back with holy water and sprinkle it all over the place so the ghost couldn't live there anymore. And we were just laughing our butts off by the time he got to that part, and one of us says, "All right, brother, you won. Come get your candy, let's get going. But Charlie wasn't done. He then started dancing on the porch, singing the Ghostbusters theme like, I ain't afraid of no ghosts. And then we were about falling over laughing. And then just as I looked up, sides hurting from laughing so hard, I saw the door behind Charlie suddenly open. And all three of us stopped laughing as Charlie spun around, just in time for this shadowy figure to come lunging towards us and snatch him up. Charlie screamed, but it was no good. This person dragged him back into the house before slamming the door closed. And then there was silence again. The moment that door slammed, the three of us went running down the driveway while yelling Charlie's name. I guess it was pure instinct, something propelling us to try and help our friend, but that front door was closed and locked, and since busting into the house some other way seemed insane, we knew the only best thing to do was to go get help. As I said, the house was like this oddity in the neighborhood, part of it but not part of it, so there were a couple of houses nearby we could run to. And we ran to the door of one, just banging on it until some angry-looking adult opened it up, and then we all started yelling together in this chaotic explosion of begging and pleading. And I guess all the guy needed to see were the looks on our faces to know that we weren't just a bunch of trick-or-treaters anymore. I remember he ran inside, called the cops, told us to all shut up, and then asked one of us to explain in a few words what had just happened before he relayed all that information to the cops. We were still freaking out, begging them to hurry, but the guy kept telling us to shut up so he could hear the dispatcher. And we then waited in the guy's front yard with him until we heard the sirens, and then we ran over to the haunted house and to where the cops pulled up and then begged them to go help Charlie. The cops ran up to the driveway, told us to stay back, and then banged on the door while we watched. I remember my buddy saying, "Kick the door open, he's in there, kick the door open." But obviously the cops wouldn't do that right away. We thought we were going to have to wait minutes, and those were minutes that we didn't think Charlie had, so we started freaking out all over again, thinking no one was taking us seriously. We all joined in, yelling at the cops to get in there and rescue our friend, but all they did was banging on the door again, saying, "Police, open up." It was agonizing, thinking Charlie was going through God knows what, and the cops are just knocking on the door like they're collecting for goodwill. But then, right after they'd knocked that last time, the door swung open again, and out stepped a man with Charlie at his side. We weren't close enough to hear what was said to the cops, but we could see Charlie just standing there, either nodding or shaking his head every time the cops directed a question to him. And that just kept going on for a minute or two as we stayed quiet, expecting the guy to get arrested at any moment. But he didn't. The cops didn't even touch their cuffs, and then another minute or two of talking, the guy walked back inside, what was by then a well-lit hallway, and shut the door again. The cops walked Charlie up the driveway towards us, and we were still in this sort of stunned silence, not able to comprehend how that grabber hadn't been arrested. But then as they got close, one of the cops was saying something like, "Lucky that gentleman was home to help your friend out, but things could have been much worse." And we're thinking, what the hell are you talking about? And started explaining Charles had been grabbed and pulled in. But then the cops basically told us not to make up tales like that, and they knew that we were trying to do some sort of prank on that place because that person wouldn't give us any candy. Now, we didn't know what he was talking about at first, but when it clicked that that grabber had tricked them somehow, one of my friends got incredibly mad, saying, That's not what happened." And he tried explaining the whole thing to the cops, like from start to finish. But then Charlie turned to him and said, "Dude, we shouldn't make up stuff like that. It's not cool." And we were stunned for what seemed like the 12th time that night. And I mean like completely stunned into silence, so all we did was just sort of stare at Charlie, thinking, what the hell's gotten into you? And the cops told us it was time to go home, and if they saw us out on the street again, causing trouble, they'd drive us all home personally with some very stern words for our parents. And this was the last thing we wanted, so we did as they said and just started walking back home. But you can bet that we asked Charlie what the hell happened in that house that made him act so suddenly weird. He told us it was dark at first, and that the guy was hurting him, bad too. The guy made Charlie tell him his name, where his family lived, where he went to school. He promised each time the pain would stop if he just told the truth. but he'd just follow up with another question while squeezing his fingers in a way that Charlie said was painful beyond all belief. The guy made Charlie tell him almost everything personal about him, and then he said if he ever showed his face around or he talked about what he'd seen inside that house, he'd burn Charlie's home down at night with his family asleep in their beds. We wanted to know why he didn't just tell the cops all that, because the guy wouldn't so much as be able to burn a piece of toast if he was in jail. But Charlie said they had people everywhere. At least that's what he's been told, and he didn't want to risk that being true. And we then asked what he'd seen, as in like the thing in the house the guy didn't want him talking about. But Charlie got mad at the very suggestion that he tell us and said that he'd never breathe a word of what he saw for as long as he lived. But that wasn't completely true, because a couple of years later, what happened that night came up in conversation. Even years later, Charlie didn't want to risk revealing what he'd seen, so he never told much in the way of detail. But all he said was that it was bad, really bad. And even at that young age of 13, he understood why the guy said that he'd kill him if he spoke about what was in there. And he said that that was what made him believe that something might actually happen if he talked, because it was obvious that they weren't normal, and that they weren't good either. Sometimes me and my friends would talk about it, the ones that were there that night, and we didn't say anything to anyone else, but sometimes we'd talk about it among ourselves when Charlie wasn't around. And sometimes we wondered if he was making it out to be more than it was. But Charlie wasn't the type. His story also stayed completely consistent, and for many, many years too. And he also refused to go anywhere near that part of the neighborhood again, and if he'd made it all up, I don't think he'd have been that scared for that long. We ended up going to different colleges later, and we ended up losing touch over time. I learned to know better than to ask what he saw inside that house, but that doesn't mean I don't wonder, and to this day, I think about whatever it was he saw, and it was so terrible that it actually scared him into keeping it secret. Last September, I somehow landed this incredible employment opportunity. The company was based out in the Pacific Northwest, and seeing that I was in NYC, I replied somewhat on a whim because the pay was so good. They gave me a call, I interviewed okay, and then when I didn't hear anything back for a couple of weeks, I figured that they just passed me over. But then one day, they called and told me that I'd got the job. I didn't say anything about not being serious regarding my application, but I did tell them that I might have some logistical issues in moving across the country and finding a place to live. I thought that I'd have them considering other candidates, but they were so dead set on bringing me aboard that they offered 12 months of free accommodation until I got onto my feet. It was a nice place too, small for a house, but well put together for what I could tell. And so in the space of around 24 hours, that application I sent off on a whim ended up changing my life. About a month later, I'd moved out to Washington to start my new job, and I was absolutely enamored with my new house. It was actually the first time that I'd lived in an actual house and not just an apartment, and having expected to live in New York City for most of my life, living in a house wasn't something I expected until I was aged like 40 or 50. It might sound kind of lame, but it was very exciting in a sort of now I'm grown up kind of way. And the thing that got me super excited as we rolled into the middle of October was that Halloween was actually approaching pretty quick. And like I said, I'd never lived in a house before. Only apartment buildings, and trick-or-treaters generally don't actually stop at apartment buildings unless there's a bowl of candy outside and some direction on who to actually buzz. And that's if they trick-or-treat at all. Because from experience, it's definitely much more of a suburban activity than an urban one. But that meant, as late October started to approach, I started planning what I was going to do for the spookiest day of the year. I carved a pumpkin, bought a ton of fun-sized candy bags, and then made sure my front windows had enough decoration to entice local trick-or-treaters. And let me tell you, it worked. And from maybe 5:30 to around 8 o'clock, I had around 24 groups of trick-or-treaters knock on my door. I saw a Waldo, a Beetlejuice, a couple of cowboys, and then there was the kid who looked exactly like the main character from The Bear, who'd also apparently mastered the "I'm so tired I could collapse" look. And I saw a mini Michael Myers who made me wonder how the hell a 10-year-old knew who Michael Myers was, but I think the best costumes of the night were two boys wearing Mario and Luigi costumes who were almost the exact same proportions as those two Italian plumbers. And after Mario and Luigi showed up, the group started to thin out a little, and rather than face being interrupted while I was cooking or showering, I just decided to put a bowl of candy out on the windowsill outside so any latecomers could actually help themselves. Now, maybe an hour later, just after 9 p.m., I sat down on my couch to check out what horror movies Netflix had to offer. I was sitting there in my bathrobe, beer bottle in one hand and the TV remote in the other, when I suddenly heard a gentle tapping on my kitchen window. The size of the house meant my kitchen and living area were right next to one another, so I could literally turn my head and see where the person was knocking. I figured someone just wanted the candy bowl refilled, and by tapping on the window, they were just being a smartass and showing off to his costume friends by acting very creepy. Now, I wasn't mad about it. I actually kind of smiled to myself thinking, alright buddy, that's exactly what I would have done. And I was also kind of half expecting a jump scare when I pulled back the blinds too, and that maybe some masked teenage troublemaker was going to growl more candy and scare me. But I was ready for them, so I grabbed the blinds, pulled them back, and just about felt my heart stop in my chest. Standing outside in the dimly lit street, I saw a lone figure wearing a ski mask and dark clothing, and he was pointing what looked to be some kind of short, black shotgun at the window. Now, I must have looked at the guy for no more than maybe a split second, no longer than the time it took to blink, but when I looked back on it, it was like he was perfectly framed by the window for maybe a minute or two. I remember how the material his ski mask was made of kind of shined in the low light, and I remember how his eyes were the widest I'd ever seen and how the whites were the whitest I'd ever seen. I remember him holding the shotgun in both hands and how it looked sleek and jet black, but kind of old and scuffed too, like it's been passed around. But then once that image had been burned into my brain, I hit the floor so hard that I ended up with some serious bruising on my arms and legs. Yet in the moment, I didn't feel so much of a twinge of pain as I slammed into the hardwood beneath me. I thought the shot was going to come at any second. I thought the glass would go flying across the room. I also figured that I was screwed either way because then he could just lean through the window and blast me. But no shot came. I'm not 100% sure how long I was lying there, but I had this weird thought of, I guess time really does stand still when you're terrified. I figured the guy was one trigger pull away from blowing out my windows and that it was seconds dragging by before he re-aimed and fired again. But then I suddenly heard a car door slam, and then a really loud revving of an engine before a car sped off into the night. I didn't get up right away. Part of me didn't trust that it was over, but then after maybe a minute or so of silence, I pushed myself up off the ground and dared to peer behind the blinds. The street outside was quiet again, just streetlights and parked cars. And then when my legs stopped shaking enough for me to actually stand, I called 911 and told the dispatcher what had just happened. And that first call out was as boring as it was frustrating because after taking my report, the cops basically told me to go get a hotel room for a night if I didn't feel safe, which, duh, I didn't feel safe. I knew they weren't exactly going to post a guard outside for little old me, but to basically be told don't like it, then leave, seemed incredibly cold. And I spent the night in a hotel and went to work that next morning with one hell of a story to tell. I figured that I'd probably spend a second night in that hotel too because I still had no idea what was going on with that masked man and his shotgun, at least until I got a phone call from a police officer in the late afternoon, and then he explained everything. So the cop who called wasn't one of the regular street cops that I'd spoken to after the incident. This guy said he was from the city's gang task force, and after hearing the report, he believed that he could provide a little insight into what had happened. According to the cop, my home's previous occupants had been gang members, and had only vacated a matter of weeks before I moved in. In all likelihood, the guy with the shotgun didn't fire because he recognized that I wasn't anyone he was looking for. And rather than murder a civilian and bring down even more heat on them, the trigger man had the wherewithal to not do his job and then dive back into the getaway car before I made it to a phone. He didn't think I'd be targeted again, not after they knew that it was some civilian in that place, and not who they thought. But as much as I'd like to say that that reassured me, I'm just not sure that it had the intended effect. I realized that up in my apartment building I was actually protected. I had some crazy nights in my time, and the streets of New York City can get equally crazy at the worst of times. But whenever I was home, I was up in my castle, 3 floors above all the craziness going on down there on the street. And it didn't even occur to me until that night how in that house I was exposed to just about any son of a bitch who came up and tapped on my window. That stayed with me too for a long time, and although there soon came a time when I felt safe enough to relax again, I also knew how terrified it'd be if I heard that same tap, tap, tapping on my window again. The scariest events of my entire childhood took place on Halloween. So I was out trick-or-treating with some friends, and we were making our way towards the neighborhood with big houses and some pretty long driveways. And we'd gotten full-size candy bars at a couple of houses the previous year. As you can imagine, we were pretty excited to get back there before they ran out. And as many of those big houses had people celebrating Halloween, so we had to walk between maybe 4 or 5 at a time before we saw ones with decorations. Now we hit up one place and then found another, but then had to walk like a whole block before we saw another place that looked like it was giving out candy. My buddies and I started walking up the driveway, and the place looked really friendly and welcoming. They didn't have just one, but 2 pumpkins out front, and whoever decorated the porch had spared no expense whatsoever. There was plastic bats hanging from the ceiling of the porch, creepy plastic root-looking things wrapped around the columns, and the front door had been draped in these fake cobwebs. It looked awesome, so I remember expecting nothing but a very warm welcome and some of those precious full-sized bars. And instead, we got something that sent us running and screaming back down the driveway. I remember pressing the bell at the side of the door but not hearing anything. I figured that it might have been one of those electric doorbells with sort of a softer ding-dong that you could only hear inside the house. But then when no one came to the door, I assumed that it was probably broken or something of that nature. And that's when I reached for the door to knock on it. But when I did, it swung open just a little on its hinges, revealing that it was unlocked and actually open. Both me and my buddies kind of looked at each other on account of how strange that was, and then I knocked once more while calling out, "Hello? Anyone home?" No one answered. And apart from the soft sound of a TV playing somewhere in the house, it stayed completely silent. And as things went from weird to creepy, one of my friends suggested that we just leave. And I felt it too. Sort of this creeping sense that we shouldn't be there, and that something bad was actually happening. But at the same time, I just had that burning curiosity, and I couldn't just walk off without first pushing that front door open. I remember reaching out very slowly, and one of my friends says, "Dude, what the hell are you doing?" But I didn't listen. I just slowly pushed the door open with the tip of my finger while calling out again to see if anyone was home. I'd hoped to see a person walking down the hall, having just neglected to fully close their door after that last bunch of trick-or-treaters had showed up. But instead, I saw an older woman lying on the floor, so that all I could see were the bottoms of her shoes. When my friend saw, he just gasped to himself, and then called out just as softly to ask if she was okay. Obviously, she wasn't okay, and I honestly thought she was dead at first. But then as soon as my buddy called out, she kind of just reared up so she was sitting on her butt and looked right at us with these eyes that looked like they were looking through us. But that's not what really scared us. What sent us running back down that driveway, screaming our little heads off, was the blood running out of the gash where her forehead met her hairline, and the raspy, scratching groan that she let out as she just sat there looking at us. The first of us to turn and run started screaming, "Zombie! It's a zombie!" at the top of his lungs. And I blame my little kid brain for this, but I was also thinking, holy crap, it really is like the living dead for a few seconds. At least until it occurred to me that there was no way in hell that that lady had come back to life after being dead, and that in actual fact, she was actually really hurt and in some serious need of help. My buddy was still yelling about zombies when we ran up the driveway of the house opposite that, and I had to tell him to shut the hell up before anyone answered the door, because they'd end up probably calling the cops thinking some kids were just playing a prank on them. And as soon as a man opened the door, I started yelling about how he needed to call an ambulance because the lady across the street was hurt. The guy yelled for his wife to call 911, then we all ran back across the street. The lady was sitting on her porch by then, holding something against her head to stop the bleeding, and having woken up a little from being out cold, she was able to talk again. I remember the guy called her Helen when he asked her what had happened, and she told him how some son of a bitch had whacked her as soon as she opened the door. It turns out the guy had been walking around in an oversized Halloween costume, mask and all, and then hit her over the head with something when she went to tell him to buzz off. She thanked us for telling someone to call 911, but she seemed to be fine, and that if we came back the next night she'd give us all of her leftover candy for being such good boys. And we did just that. And there she was, with a bandage around her head and with her husband thanking us for helping her. I'm glad everything turned out okay, we all were, but at the time it was one of the most frightening things I'd ever experienced. I guess at that perfect age where I knew what I was seeing, but my mind couldn't quite process all that fear and dread that came with it. I thought that I was seeing the dead coming back to life, and that was horrifying to me. But now I understand the real tragedy is that when they're gone, there's no coming back for the people we love.